Bleach 1000-Year Blood War arc is a mess. It consists of many parts that lack any meaningful setup, making this arc more like a filler than a continuation of the Aizen arc. And by Aizen arc, I mean everything that happened before the 1000-Year Blood War arc. Without meaningful setup, the story ends up frustrating the audience. How can you feel rewarded as a fan when major plot points seem to come out of nowhere? The best stories introduce concepts, characters, and reference past events so it can use them in the future. When done right, the audience can appreciate the major payoffs in the story. If done wrong, you have a case like Bleach 1000-Year Blood War arc where the events in this arc don't line up with the Aizen arc. It felt like Kubo on the fly expanded upon the lore without carefully considering the past events. Something I think even the biggest fans of the series could at least admit. Despite problems like this, some people actually prefer the 1000-Year Blood War arc over the Aizen arc, which is already depressing as is, but when you consider all the problems of this arc, I wonder why people like it at all. Look, Kubo can do whatever he wants, but that doesn't mean it's automatically good or peak fiction, whatever that means. With that in mind, today we are going to focus on how Bleach 1000-Year Blood War arc lacked any meaningful setup behind the main events of its narrative and how it ultimately damaged the story. I will focus on the three biggest offenders: Chōjirō, the Quincy's return, and KENPACHI and UNOHANA'S forced connection. Until this arc, we didn't have much time with Chōjirō, unlike the other lieutenants. He was just that guy that served as a jobber for Ichigo to defeat once he learned Bankai. We just never knew much about him. He was Yamamoto's lieutenant, he liked to make tea, he didn't really seem too confident in himself, very kind of shy and reserved. This character came across as a clown than someone I would take seriously, which was the opposite of how the flashback showed him, which was kinda odd. The most important part here though is, because we don't spend much time with this character, I felt nothing when the Quincy's killed him. But do you know who was affected by his death? Yamamoto. Chōjiro's death broke the old man, causing him to act dumber than usual, which is saying something because Yamamoto is a special kind of stupid. One could argue that was the stern writer's reason for targeting Chōjirō, to break Yamamoto. Or maybe YHWACH wanted revenge for the death blow he dealt to him 1,000 years ago. In the end, it doesn't matter why they killed him or how it broke Yamamoto. We as an audience don't feel anything here, because why would we when we've gotten almost nothing from this character, making his death no less sadder than any other Soul Reaper that has died along the way. You can argue that a captain and a lieutenant have a strong bond, something we see with other characters. Thus, Yamamoto's reactions might make sense to the audience, but then you have to ask, if it's obvious, then why would you show any of the captains and lieutenants' close connection to each other? There are consistency issues with how Kubo wrote the story. There's no reason why Kubo could not have included more time with these characters if he planned on killing one of them off later on, as we saw with Chōjirō. This might have been due to the fact that Kubo rushed the story and probably wasn't even his initial plan. To compensate for the lack of prior setup, Kubo implements a technique that I'm going to call the last minute sympathy flashback. As its name suggests, this is when you show a flashback of a character's past after or right before they die as a manipulative tactic to get the audience to feel, well, sympathy. This is usually done to compensate for the lack of scenes with that character, but that's not always the case. It's not even a bad technique in general. Sometimes it works well, like in a short story like Akame ga Kill. It's just so frustrating that Kubo chose to go this route when there are better examples of how he's handled this in the same anime. Early on in the Soul Society arc, Kubo showed us that Sajin and Tolson are good friends. We see flashbacks of Sajin and Tolson discussing their motivations behind their actions. There are scenes where Sajin expresses his understanding for Tolson's noble goals. Kubo spent a good amount of time setting up the close bond between these two. That's what made Tolson's betrayal understandably hard on Sajin, and we of course as the audience understood it as well. Continuing on, during the battle in the fake Karakura town, Sanjin along with Hisagi defeated Tolson. During this fight, we once again see the same flashbacks. The story doesn't need to rely on these scenes, instead it just enhances what's going on. Tolson would then succumb to his injuries and die in a really horrible way. Sanjin's reaction to Tolson's death is impactful to both him and the audience. He's livid, fed up with everything Aizen has done to him and his friends. Aizen took advantage of Tolson's devotion to justice to manipulate him to join his cause. Now imagine instead of all that prior setup, the entire relationship between Sanjin and Tolson was only shown to us right after Tolson died in a flashback. Do you see how lazy and bad that would have been? Well, that's the entire situation with Chōjirō. We get almost nothing until after the character dies, which is a damn shame because from what we did see in that flashback, Chōjirō seemed like a really cool character. What's even more depressing is we're still not done in talking about how Kubo ruined Chōjiro's character. In this arc, he revealed that he had a Bankai, which is depressing because we didn't even know much about Zanpakuto to begin with. We got more development in a filler arc than the original anime. Think about that for a moment. All we knew about his Zanpakuto was that its Shikai release had some kind of purple lightning and the sword itself looked kinda cool. But this Bankai reveal, this retcon, caused so much damage to the prior events. Let's go through how. Here's a quick question. If Chōjirō developed his Bankai 1,000 years ago, then wouldn't that technically make him the strongest lieutenant during the Aizen arc? No one else had the same amount of experience with a Bankai, assuming they had one at all. Which then begs the question how Ichigo took out the strongest lieutenant with one punch. This is the same character that gave Yamamoto that scar in his head. Heck, I don't even think that Ichigo beats him in a fistfight altogether. I'm not even arguing that Ichigo wasn't stronger, but not to that degree. Here's another thing to consider. If Chōjirō helped defeat YHWACH, why did Yamamoto not deploy him in the front lines to fight the Espada and Aizen? Chōjirō instead was relegated to preventing people from entering the barrier. An important job for sure, but not the job for the strongest lieutenant. KUBU with this retcon wasted the strongest lieutenant in the Aizen arc. I guess Chōjiro's keeping the Bleach tradition alive of making the strongest characters completely pointless. The next thing that you gotta ask is, why? Why did Kubo do this? What's with the retcon, changing the past, all this stuff? Well, I came up with an idea that's just a theory, but it kinda makes sense. Assuming it's true, it only makes the situation worse. Kubo wanted to kill off someone in the story while demonstrating that Quincy's could steal Bankai. Now, who do you kill off? You can't kill Toshiro, Sanjin, Byakuya, and characters like them because he needs them for future fights in the story, and given how popular they are, if he did kill them off, there'd be a lot of pushback from the audience. He can't kill off Rose, Shunsui, Joshiro, Love, Shinji, and Unohana because we haven't seen their Bankai yet. So to fix this, Kubo needed to use an irrelevant character to accomplish his goals. Let's be honest. Does anyone gonna miss Chōjirō now that he's dead? No. He chose to kill Chōjirō while revealing he had a Bankai that the Quincy's stole. We then get a last minute flashback to show that Chōjirō always had a Bankai and was very close to Yamamoto. Again, I can't prove this, but it kinda makes sense. If you ask me, given how Rose does F-all in this arc, even with his Bankai, Kubo should have just killed him along with Chōjirō. He could use Rose to show off the Quincy's ability to steal Bankai, and Chōjirō to mentally destroy Yamamoto. Kubo could then show flashback in future chapters to recount what happened to Rose so the audience can see his Bankai. Or you could just have Driscoll use that Bankai instead of Chōjiro's when he fights Yamamoto. It is really disappointing how Kubo ruined Chōjiro's character as a means to get the story going when it wasn't necessary to do so. He has shown in the past better ways to achieve the same outcome, and that's why I'm so angry about this. This is unacceptable from someone this talented. Now before anyone types in the comments, let's address some things. Yes, I'm aware the Quincy's, and specifically the Extermination War, was discussed in the original series. I'm also worried that Zangetsu was going to say YHWACH's name, but didn't because according to Kubo, Ichibe stopped him. Great retroactive writing there, Kubo. These two facts don't fix the problems with the Quincy return, and I'm not even against the Quincy return as a concept. Narratively speaking, it makes sense for the Quincy's to be the final opponents for the Shinigami. The setup writes itself, with the Quincy seeking vengeance for the extermination. The problem isn't the idea, but the execution itself. Let's start with the obvious problem. The Quincy return was never hinted to or mentioned in the Aizen arc. Among the past explanations of the Quincy's culture, power, and history, resurrection wasn't mentioned. Sure, the Ishidas are a Quincy family that survived over the years, but you can't use that as a setup for the Quincy's return, especially since the return had nothing to do with the family. So how do they literally come back after the Shinigami killed them all? Well, the story attempts, and I use that word generously, to explain this through YHWACH, and that's the next problem here. YHWACH, the leader of the Quincy's. To understand why this frustrated me, let me talk about my experience of first reading the 1000-Year Blood War arc manga. Upon learning KUBU was going to conclude the series with this manga, there were 4 things I wanted to see, those being Aizen's backstory as a captain, Squad Zero, seeing the remaining Bankais, and finding out which ships became official couples. Notice how I didn't say anything about YHWACH. I wonder why. Because we didn't learn anything about this character in the previous arcs. I remember reading the manga for the first time wondering who the heck this guy is. The character looked like Zangetsu for some reason. I originally assumed to have missed something in the Aizen arc, which of course wasn't true. KUBU made up this brand new character for the arc and did a terrible job of tying him to the established lore. Let's go over what I mean. YHWACH is the first Quincy whose blood flows into every Quincy, even Masaki, Ichigo's mother. Ichigo inherited YHWACH's blood, which is why Zangetsu looks like YHWACH. This makes Zangetsu a reflection of Ichigo's Quincy powers, or some nonsense like that. And I say nonsense because this was explained in such a painstakingly method through exposition dump, since none of it had any meaningful setup. The only possible hint was what Aizen said in this scene, but that only related to Ichigo being part Quincy and has nothing to do with YHWACH. Continuing on with the damage that YHWACH's introduction to the story caused, now all of a sudden everyone's talking about him as if he's been a thing this whole time. How convenient. I'm at least going to give some props for the setup of Ichigo's true Bankai, even though some of it didn't make a lot of sense. But with YHWACH, there's no meaningful setup aside from extremely vague hints. Now, there's nothing wrong with having stuff in the background that leads to nice payoff in the story. It only becomes an issue when these vague setups have a major impact on the story. Remember, we are talking about apparently the most dangerous enemy to the Soul Society and Yamamoto's biggest mistake. Setups for your major events should not be a random Easter egg hunt, but things that are outright explained or shown to you. For example, Aizen as the main villain was set up in plain sight. There wasn't vague hints like with YHWACH. If YHWACH was this dangerous adversary from the past, why does no one mention his name once? Is there a reason why we couldn't have that scene of Mayuri and Yamamoto talking about YHWACH during the Aizen arc? I liked their conversation, but it was clearly out of place and only happened as part of Kubo's attempt to tie everything together with duct tape. If you think about it, there are so many times where YHWACH should have been discussed given who he is. Yamamoto could have discussed how they must proceed carefully with Aizen to avoid past mistakes, or because Aizen is not the only threat out there. Or Aizen could have referenced YHWACH upon his defeat, letting Ichigo and Kisuke know that the failures of the Soul Society will come back to bite them. And then he hints to this by saying, "You know what I speak of," when looking at Kisuke Urahara. Another good spot he could have brought this up was during his battle against Yamamoto. He could taunt them how he will fail to kill him, just like he failed to kill YHWACH. And considering everyone seems to know about YHWACH, it wouldn't be out of place for Aizen to say that. But instead, we get none of that. It's like everyone had their memories erased and then restored for this arc, which is why again it feels like filler and not a continuation of the series. Do you know why I was hyped to learn about Squad Zero? It's because we learn about them in the 100-year Turn Back the Pendulum Time arc. We even learn the name of the newest member, Kiryu. During the 1000-Year Blood War arc, there's a simple scene where she asked Shinji if he recognized her. This worked because KUBU established early on that Shinji and Hiyori are close, and Hiyori's captain became a new member of Squad Zero, which is Kiryu. So of course Shinji knows who she is. It upsets me that KUBU used proper setup for the side conversation and not for the main antagonist of this arc. There's no reason why we can't have a scene of Uryu discussing with Ichigo about YHWACH as the son of the Soul King, who's the father of the Quincy's. He can even state that some believe YHWACH could come back to life one day. Instead, we get nothing. I don't care about his initial big impact in the story. It's irrelevant because I don't know who this character is, since no one told me and we didn't have any prior setup in the Aizen arc. Due to the lack of setup, YHWACH was just another Karia Amagai, Koga/Miramasa, or Oko Yoshima, and honestly even Ginjo. But I can forgive the lack of setup for Ginjo since his impact on the plot is not even close to YHWACH, and the other characters are from filler arcs, so they get a pass. Simply put, if you want to have a main antagonist who's supposedly responsible for prior events and to serve as a logical choice for the final villain, then you have to lay the foundation for this character before they are introduced, not afterwards. Something that KUBU hasn't done with other characters. I have read other people consider the Quincy invasion as maybe the best part in Bleach. This idea alone hurts me as it insults the legacy of the grander moments from the Aizen arc. Since we didn't spend any time with the Stern Rider beforehand, I wasn't invested in any of it. That's probably the biggest consequence of no prior setup. Imagine if Aizen's first appearance in anime was right after the Soul Society arc where he invaded with the Espada. That would have been confusing and would ruin the story. It's the time KUBU spent setting up Aizen and the Arrancar is what made the final battle meaningful. KUBU took the introduce first and explain later approach with the Quincies, something he's never done before on this scale, and ultimately ruined the manga and the anime. KENPACHI's connection to Unohana is maybe the worst part of this arc. It ruined KENPACHI's character and retcon the story just to justify why this one scene makes sense. The connection doesn't work because the two characters don't have a past connection to each other. The only exception is that KENPACHI names YHWACH after the person he admires the most. In this arc, KUBU revealed that Retsu Unohana's first name was actually YHWACH all along, so KENPACHI was referring to her when he said someone that he admired the most. That's gotta be the laziest reveal I've ever seen in a long while. The last minute retcon caused so much damage to the story, and here's how. If Unohana meant that much to KENPACHI as the Araki, why don't the two ever interact in the story? And no, that filler episode doesn't count. In that example, KENPACHI doesn't walk away as someone who is familiar with Unohana, and instead, just like everyone else, walks away because he respects her power. Also, it's a filler, so it doesn't count. Continuing on, the Araki doesn't even think about Unohana once, which given their connection should have happened during any of his battles or as he sits by himself with just his thoughts. Here's a simple fix that KUBU should have considered when he first created the story if this was his eventual plan, which is debatable. While talking to YHWACH in the flashback, we see the person he admires the most walking away in the distance, but that person's blacked out. Then, during each subsequent fight, KENPACHI continues to see this person, and finally once he fights Unohana, that person from the flashback turns around, revealing them to be her. This idea isn't perfect, but it's way better than what we got, which was nothing. So from the retcon, we're supposed to believe that Unohana's impact on Zaraki was so impactful that he forgets about her until their fight, where all of a sudden the two act as if they had some prior history, but he remembered her enough to name YHWACH after her. Just like with Chōjirō, there's no consistency here. Why is this praised for its good writing? Going further, you could flip the same logic to Unohana. She claimed to be disappointed with Zaraki supposedly holding back his power, which is complete garbage by the way, but yet we never see her watching Zaraki fight. She doesn't talk to Zaraki after his fights, which should have at least happened against Niatora since she wasn't too far from the area. We don't even see Unohana present when Zaraki was training with Yamamoto. It's improbable that she was invested in Zaraki's development when it's never shown or told to us except during this fight. I remember being confused when first reading this part in the story and wondering why KENPACHI was acting so familiar with Unohana. This wasn't the case where I was thinking, of course Unohana is familiar with KENPACHI. They have a history together. She helped train him, because that didn't happen in the story. And no, just saying they are both KENPACHIs is enough to explain the connection is BS, because KUBU doesn't treat the connection of any other characters like this. Like every other new element in the story, KUBU has to explain everything as it happens, which is about as last minute as you can get. This is frustrating because KUBU did a great job setting up the relationship with other characters in the Aizen arc. Here's my favorite example. During the Soul Society arc, while Yoruichi escapes with Ichigo, she encounters Byakuya Kuchiki on the bridge. It is there that Yoruichi mentions that Byakuya has never caught her in the past with his flash step, which stays true here since Yoruichi escapes from Byakuya. KUBU established that these two have a past, most likely that Yoruichi trained him. This past is later explored in the 100 Years Turn Back the Pendulum arc, where Yoruichi teaches Byakuya as a teenager and they chase each other with the flash step. The previous scene set up these two had a past, and the payoff came up in the flashback. Great stuff. stuff. And finally, during his battle against Zamari, he begrudgingly uses a technique she taught him to save his life. Since they have referenced at least twice that Yoruichi trained Byakuya, this is believable and it makes sense. Byakuya has interacted with Yoruichi on numerous occasions. This is how you set up a past history between two characters that occurred behind the scenes. Now imagine if during this arc, Byakuya had to learn a powerful forbidden technique that would unlock his hidden power. Shunsui would then ask Yoruichi to help out in this manner. You of course wouldn't be surprised for Yoruichi to act so familiar with Byakuya since it's established that the two know each other quite well. If she revealed more about their past while training Byakuya, it wouldn't come across as forced or random. That's the difference between these two situations. With KENPACHI and UNOHANA, KUBU establishes everything in the moment, having to forcibly connect past events where no connection can be found. And with Byakuya and Yoruichi, KUBU progressively established the relationship throughout the story. So if KUBU used his approach with Byakuya and Yoruichi, with KENPACHI and UNOHANA, the two could spend more time on training and less time explaining their past history since it was already established. I guess this is what happens when you have to rush your story. Because I dare to criticize this arc, calling out its obvious mistakes, people wrongly assume that I hate Bleach or straight out can't be a Bleach fan, which is just telling and wrong. Bleach is the reason why I watch Code Geass, Death Note, Monster, Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Trigun, Rurouni Kenshin, GTO, and so forth. These complaints come from someone who loves Bleach and is disappointed with the direction of this arc. KUBU set the standard for the quality of his work with the brilliant storytelling and character development in the Aizen arc, so it pains me to see this arc fall way below those standards. It's like these stories weren't written by the same person. I imagine what could have been an arc that had compelling characters, an amazing story, and of course proper setup. Given how KUBU made up so much stuff on the fly, I wish he'd just spend more time in the planning phase of the story. But instead, this is the story we got, and it's terrible. This video clarifies my thoughts on Bleach. I am a Bleach fan, just not a complacent one.